Okay, welcome everybody to another Endgame video. It's been quite a while since I've made an Endgame video, but today I felt inspired, and I felt inspired by the fact that a couple of days ago, at the time of recording, the Champions Chess Tour concluded in Toronto. This was the final of a season-long event held by chess.com. And to the surprise of exactly no one, Magnus Carlsen dominated. A lot of you watching were probably watching the event live. Maybe some of you were even in Toronto. It was an incredible event that featured Magnus, Hikaru, Wesley So, Alireza Firouzja, and others. It produced some absolutely incredible action, some crazy Armageddon games. And of course, where would we be without one time scramble after another? The time control was 15 minutes with a 10-second increment. So we had time scrambles and blunders galore in the CCT. But my job on this channel is to cull the most instructive content from all of these tournaments and to present it to you in sort of bite-sized portions. And so I decided to go through the games from the CCT and select what I believe to be are the most interesting, the most instructive, the most noteworthy endings from the three stages of the Champions Chess Tour final. We had the round-robin stage, then we had the survival stage, and of course we had the final between Magnus Carlsen and the runner-up Wesley So. And I've selected 6 very interesting endgames. Some of them feature Magnus Carlsen, others feature Abdusattorov and Hikaru Nakamura. We will go through them one by one, and as usual with endgame videos, I will give you ample opportunities to pause the video and try to solve exercises on your own. And most importantly, I hope that this video will be instructive, entertaining, and you will be able to take home specific lessons and takeaways on various different types of endings. So for starters, let's jump in with the position in front of us. We will go in sort of reverse chronological order. We start with a very simple position. This is kind of the appetizer round. You can consider this just sort of a warm-up to get your brain whirring and working in the right direction, literally and figuratively, as you'll see, because you might have been staring at this position all along as I've been blabbering and trying to figure out where the pawns are going, and don't worry, I'll help you out with that. So this first example comes from the final between Magnus Carlsen and Wesley So. Magnus has the white pieces and Wesley has black. We are facing the white side, Magnus Carlsen. Wesley's pawns are, in fact, going forward. This is very, very bad news for Magnus, who is currently up a rook. No, that is not a wrong position setup. Yes, he is up a rook, but yes, he is also completely losing because he simply cannot stop these connected passers, which are both on the second rank. But before resigning the game, Magnus Carlsen sets up an absolutely devilish trick. First things first, let's see if you can figure out the devilish idea that Magnus Carlsen implemented in this position to give Wesley So one last test. So you might be attracted by 2 different factors that may lead you to believe that white has some defensive potential. The first is the c-pawn. But it doesn't take long to understand that the c-pawn is way too far away to cause black any problems. If you play c5, black is just going to make a queen, and that will be that. The second more pertinent factor is the arrangement of the rook and the knight on the 7th rank. And you might be familiar with a whole host of various mechanisms in which the knight and the rook essentially pursue the king either until checkmate or lock the king up in some sort of perpetual check. And so your instinct might be to start checking, to play knight h7 check, and to try to box the king in with a series of knight checks. And indeed, if the king goes to the right, then everything is groovy. If it goes to h8, then you can deliver an Arabian mate on h7. Unfortunately, the king is going to run the other way. Black is going to play king f8, and if white continues to check, the king is simply going to escape to the left side of the board. Knight f6, king to d8, and after rook d7, king c8, white is out of meaningful checks, and on the next move, black is going to make one queen and then a second queen. But Magnus does not give up there. He plays the very thematic move, rook b7 to d7, and this is a worthwhile mechanism for you to remember. The point is that the rook now cuts off the king along the d-file, and if black simply makes a queen, now the mechanism leads to perpetual check. After knight h7 check, king e8, the knight returns to f6, and the king is unable to keep running to the left. Of course, the knight also protects the rook. And if you're not familiar with this mechanism, then either write it down or take a snapshot of it with your phone, because this arrangement of the rook and the knight is extremely important. It's allowed so many players through the years to save a lot of hopeless positions. But now comes part 2 of the exercise. Does Wesley So acquiesce to the draw, or does he have a hidden resource to cut through this mechanism and win the game? Let's flip the board. Now it's your turn to face the black side. Remember, black is going up now. Can Wesley So cut through and thwart this drawing mechanism? The answer, of course, is yes. Otherwise, I would not be posing this exercise to you. Now, logically, the only piece that could do anything about this mechanism is the knight on d3, but the move knight e5 doesn't actually help. So Wesley So begins with a check on f4. Magnus moves the king to f3, and now comes the critical move. Knight f4 drops back to h5. This is the only winning move. It's a brilliant defensive idea. And the idea of this move is very, very simple. The pawns are self-sufficient. They will promote when the time is right. The point is that after knight h7, king e8, white no longer has access to the f6 square with his knight. And after knight h5, Magnus was simply forced to resign the game. If white takes on h5, black doesn't even have to rush with promotion. We can simply recapture on h5, and once again, the pawns are going to prevail. I did do a knight versus pawns endgame video in which I talked about the idea of using a check against the king to get the knight to the appropriate spot. We will see this again and again in endgames involving knights, and it's very important to understand that a single minor piece, the placement of the king on a particular square, can change the evaluation of the position. If the king was not on g2, but on h2 or on g3, the evaluation would be drawn. It's because the king was on g2 and because it was checkable by the knight that Wesley So was able to win this game, although he did end up losing the finals match. So that was a warm-up exercise. Now we get to the more fun exercises. Let's flip the board again, and let's go to our second example. Once again, it features Magnus Carlsen, who has the white pieces against Alireza Firouzja. Now, this particular game, which was an Armageddon, has kind of made the rounds. You might have actually been watching this live. This position might be familiar to you, but it contains a lot of instructive details that have kind of remained behind the scenes. So this is the position that we start from. Magnus has the white pieces. His pawns are going forward, and clearly he is trying to win the game. First things first, pause the video and try to come up with the cleanest way of winning this game for white. And I apologize for the compulsive water drinking. I've just had a long stream today, and I've done a lot of talking, so I'm on the cusp of losing my voice. Hopefully it lasts me through this video. Okay, so how do we approach this position? The basic idea is that we have a passed pawn on e6, and black has a passed pawn on f3. So white has two fundamental approaches. White can push e7 and try to win the pawn race, or white can try to stop the f-pawn with the knight. Now, if you're playing and you have this position in a classical game, it makes sense to start by calculating the move e7 because it is the most forcing move. And e7 leads to a really beautiful line. Believe it or not, the move e7 gives up the win. And after e7, black is able to salvage a miracle draw. And black does not play the move f2. If black plays f2, then white can simply capture the knight. And with a knight and an extra pawn, white wins pretty easily. Instead, black begins by delivering a check on f7. Now, you might have seen that and said, okay, but after knight f7 check, white can shift the king over to e6, dominating the knight. Black has nothing better than to push the pawn. White promotes to a queen. Black promotes to a queen. Now, very importantly, the queen protects the knight. But you might have said, yes, I saw all of this, and I calculated one step further. The queen can deliver a check on g8, force the king to the side. We take the knight on f7, and we are completely winning. Except we are not completely winning because it is black to move. And you should know that in queen endgames, it's not always about who has the most extra material. The side whose move it is holds tremendous power, because in queen endgames, the king is generally a super vulnerable piece, and black has an incredibly nasty check on c4 here. And if you manage to calculate this far, then big kudos to you. Queen c4 check is the drawing resource. The king has to maintain contact with the queen. But if it moves up to e7, then white gives away the knight with check, and the draw is elementary. So king f6 is the only feasible move. And now another accurate check is delivered on d4. Amazingly, the king, which is blocked by its own queen, and its mobility circumscribed also by black's king, is unable to move away from the checks without stumbling into queen takes e5 check. King f5, queen takes e5 once again is a check, and king e6, queen c4 check is a repetition of moves. A pretty amazing drawing idea. And this is why, after e7, f2, it would be a grave mistake for white to promote to a queen, which is absolutely crazy. e8 queen check looks like the game is over, but black interposes with check. And as a matter of fact, this is winning, I think, after king e7, but the win here would be very, very difficult to achieve. And if white plays king e6, and we have transposed into the drawing line that we just analyzed via the e7, knight f7 check move order. So e7 actually gives up the win. And the correct approach is to stop the pawn with the knight. But there are two ways to do that. We can play knight d3 and we can play knight e4. Both of those moves win the game, but one wins the game a lot more cleanly than the other. The correct move, and the move that wins most cleanly, is knight to e4. Okay, knight to e4, stopping the pawn and preparing to push e7. Knight e4 finishes the game almost immediately. There is just nothing that black can do here. The only attempt is knight b7 check. But now we use the kind of zigzag method. We play king to c6. It would be also possible to play king c7, but this is a little bit sloppier. Here, black has knight c5, and you still have some work to do. You can play knight takes c5 and promote with check, but that drags the game on. Instead, it's more precise to go king to c6, force the knight back to d8, and now zigzag forward to d7. This simply ends the game. Black can give up the knight for the pawn, but then there's no further progress to be made, and white simply pushes the b pawn up the board. And if black plays knight b7, then e7 ends the game. e8 queen check is coming. So if you found knight e4, kudos to you. But in the game, with just a couple of seconds left on his clock, both players had been surviving on increment for something like 15 moves at this point. Magnus played the less precise winning move, knight to d3. Now, what is the difference between knight e4 and knight d3? Simply use the process of comparison, by which I mean consider the squares that the knight is covering on d3 and the squares that the knight is covering on e4. And you should see that on e4, the knight covers this very important square on f6, which does not allow black's king to meaningfully approach the pawn. Of course, black can play king f5, but this does not help because white has e7 anyway. In the game, after knight d3, Firouzja was able to find king f6. Well, white has to push e7, and it suddenly turns out that after knight f7 check, white is very, very close to simply losing this pawn. The king has to maintain contact with the pawn, and so Magnus moves his king up to d7. And in this position, Firouzja lost on time as he was making the move f2, which is actually a brilliant defensive move. The move f2 forces white to find an only winning move and a brilliant winning idea in order to rein in the full point. So the final exercise in this example, pause the video here and see if you can figure out what the only winning sequence is in this position. And those of you who spend time on like chess social media, you might have seen this on Twitter or in an article. This has already kind of made the rounds. White to play. Okay, so the first important thing is to determine why we can't simply take the pawn on f2. Well, the reason is that f2 was actually a deflection tactic. It was a simple deflection, right? The point is to deflect the knight from d3 and to deflect the knight from its control over the e5 square. And once again, black is waging a war to try to force the king to lose contact with the e7 pawn. This is a very common defensive technique in knight endgames. You basically circle around and keep delivering checks until the king gives up and loses contact with the pawn. So if king d7, you just keep checking. Knight f7, king d7, knight e5, etc. The only meaningful winning attempt here is not king d8 that walks into a fork, but king to e8 getting behind the pawn. But this move gives black a very valuable tempo, and even though black does not have any checks, we are able to surround the pawn with our knight. Knight to g6 is the winning move, is the drawing move, that is. And amazingly, even though white now has the knight at his disposal, white is now unable to save the e7 pawn. You can give a check on e4, but it's a meaningless check. Black plays king e6, and black's king is going to circle around d6, e6, and f6 as necessary, depending on where the knight delivers the check. You can go knight c5, you can go knight b7. It literally does not matter where you give checks. As long as the black king essentially circles between e6 and d6, white is completely unable to make progress. Knight f7, king e6. White has danced around the entire board, but black simply goes between d6 and e6. Notice that king f6 is actually a grave error, because here there's a beautiful little geometrical sequence, knight h7 check, and suddenly the knight gets to f8, forcing the knight trade. This is how tricky knight endgames are. I am preparing the first knight endgame video, and the amount of examples I see where even ultra experienced players make mistakes like this in what seem to be very elementary positions is pretty crazy. It's so easy to forget about these various tricks. The knight is a devilish piece. So you actually have to stick between e6 and d6 specifically. And actually, you might begin to wonder why knight g6 and not knight c6. Here, the reason is also very elegant. White plays knight e4 check. White initiates the dance. Okay, king f6, blah, blah, blah. If king to d6, then there is the same idea on the opposite side. Isn't this beautiful? We just saw this with the knight on f8 and the black knight on g6. Now we see this with the knight on d8 and the black knight on c6. If black goes the other way, if black goes to f6, here the winning idea, I actually didn't fully analyze this, is here, king e6, knight f8 check, king f6, and now there is an incredible move, knight to g6. Insane sacrifice, pulling the king away from the pawn, and now king f8 wins the game. Black is forced to give up the knight for the pawn, and white now is able to promote the g-pawn. So amazingly, knight c6 does not work. Only knight g6 draws the game. And you might now ask, well, wait, doesn't white have the same type of trick with the knight on g6? And the answer is no. If white tries the same type of trick, right, if white plays knight c5 check, king d6, knight b7 check, knight d8 check, and knight to c6, which is the same exact thing on the opposite side of the board, here the problem is black's king is in very close proximity to the b pawn. So after king f7, black can give up the knight for the pawn and play king b5. Such is the depth of knight endgames with only a couple of pawns left on the board. So let's review that one more time, because I know that was a lot. First of all, and we haven't even gotten to the winning move yet, what we have determined is that the only drawing move in this position is knight to g6. Okay? And the mechanism of defense should be very clear to you. Once again, the reason why knight to c6 doesn't work is because after knight e4 check, and knight c5 check, and knight d7 check, and knight f8 check, white plays the incredible move knight to g6. And after king takes g6, if black doesn't take the knight, then white can still step away from the pawn, because the knight now defends the pawn. And here, white plays king f8, and the key difference is that with the knight on g6, the black king was on c6. With the knight on c6, the black king was on g6. The symmetry of this endgame is something out of like a Da Vinci painting. Like the interrelationship between the c6 and g6 squares is pretty incredible. Long story short, the move knight takes f2 squanders the win. The move e8 queen also squanders the win. Here black simply promotes, and one extra pawn is not enough, clearly not enough, to win this endgame. And so big kudos to you if you were able to determine that e8 equals knight check, and under promotion, if there ever was one, is the only winning move. White makes a knight with check, then white calmly recaptures the pawn on f2, and it's not necessarily clear at the outset that this is a winning endgame, because if black is able to give up the knight for the pawn, it is a theoretical draw. Two knights are not able to mate the bare king. But if you analyze this endgame, it turns out that black is simply unable to approach this pawn with his knight. For example, if knight e5 check, white plays king c7, and black's problem is going to be that anytime he gets close to the pawn, white simply forces the trade of knights. I looked at this endgame. It is winning for white with a little bit of careful play, but I will not bog you down with the details. So this is a very rare example of a situation in which only an under promotion wins the game. The under promotion is the only move which wins cleanly. Every other move squanders the victory. And that is how the game could have ended if Alireza did not flag. Of course, maybe Magnus would have captured on f2, And then, well, we have no idea what would have happened. Sadly, Alireza flagged as he was playing the move f2, and this will forever remain behind the scenes. That was our second example. Now, what's interesting is that as I was analyzing this, I started to remember something. I started to remember a blitz game that I had played a couple of years ago against none other than Alireza Firouzja himself. I was like, man, something about this Carlsen-Firouzja game really rings a bell. And so I dug deep into my game archive, and I found the game against Alireza Firouzja, which I remembered through the lens of that Carlsen-Firouzja game. And we joined the battle in this position. I have the black pieces. This was played approximately 2 years ago in a casual 3+0 game. You can also find a clip of this game and me streaming it on YouTube if you search Daniel Naroditsky under promotion. So this was the position in which the fun begins. I have sacrificed a knight, and I've sacrificed it in order to generate a major pawn majority on the queen side. The goal for black is very clear. We want to promote a pawn. If we don't promote a pawn, then we probably lose the game because we're down a minor piece. And so the big question here, first question, do we play b3 or do we play b takes c3? Pause the video, try to make that determination. Pretty simple question. Okay, so this is a matter of straightforward calculation. It's important to point out that in pawn endgames, you generally want to make the pass pawn that is furthest away from the enemy king. So if the knight was gone, then your instinct should be to play b3. But with knights on the board, the patterns are a little bit different. You basically want to create the pass pawn that is hardest for the knight to stop. And so by that logic, the correct move is actually bc. b3 is a terrible blunder because after the trade, white's knight is simply able to stop the b pawn from d2, and then white's king stops the black king from progressing with king f2, and white actually wins the game because the knight will park itself on b1 and fully blockade black's connected passers. So b3 loses the game. I played b takes c3, thinking, okay, the game is basically over. But Alireza does not go gentle into that good knight. Knight f3, setting a trap. If you blindly play c2, the knight picks off the pawn with a fork. So I realized, well, I should probably get my king out of the way. And while I'm at it, I should probably eliminate the pawn on f4. So king takes f4 was on the board. And now Alireza plays a devilish move, king to f2, which was not on my radar at all. I had assumed that knight e1 was forced, and here the win is pretty elementary. Our king makes it to the d2 square in time. Then we push c2. The knight is forced to sacrifice itself for the first c-pawn, and then the second c-pawn decides the outcome of the game. Knight f3 check, you just go king d1 and push the c-pawn. This is very easy. But Alireza plays king f2, and suddenly I realize what his idea is. If we push c2, then white plays knight d4. And after we promote to a queen, white picks off the newly promoted queen with knight e2 and wins the game. King e4, simply knight takes c1. And to my horror, I realized that if I don't push the pawn, then white can fully stop their progress by dropping the knight back to e1. And so frantically, I started trying to find something. And it was pretty quickly that I understood the path to victory. Now, having seen the Carlsen-Firouzja game, the correct path should be, you should be pretty primed to see the right approach here. But nonetheless, pause the video, see if you can figure out the path to victory here for black. Same exact theme. Okay, so of course we play c2, and after knight d1, we don't make a queen, we make a knight. I mean, chess is a pretty incredible game. It's just insane to me on a basic level that there are situations where you have to make like the much less valuable piece. Such is the beauty of like the uniqueness of the knight's movement. We make a knight, and black now has a completely winning endgame because we simply have a passed c-pawn, and this passed c-pawn is way too far advanced. Our king is way too active, and the rest of the game is fairly straightforward. I will kind of fast forward to one other interesting moment. I pushed my pawn, I brought my knight back, I did everything correct, and then Alireza was desperately trying to stop my pawn. We got a pretty similar situation to the Magnus Carlsen game, and in this position, I found one last finesse to seal the game in style. Black to play and win the game on the spot. So the correct move here is the deflection sacrifice, knight to f3 check, giving away the knight in order to make possible king b2 followed by c1 queen. We made a couple more meaningless moves and I won the game. If you play the immediate king to b2, you actually allow white to sacrifice the knight for the pawn. And winning this position is actually pretty hard because white's king is going to make a beeline for the g7 pawn. There's going to be a pawn race. Black is winning with some precise play, but why bother with this when you have the simple knight f3 check, sacking the knight, and then king b2 and c1 queen. So the Magnus game reminded me of an under promotion that I had against the very same Alireza Firouzja. Under promotion in the endgame is one of my favorite themes. Okay, on we go to our next example. Okay, now this one is absolutely off the frickin' wall. We're about 26 minutes into the video. I'm hoping to keep this at about 45 to 50 minutes, so we'll see if I manage to do that. We might have to split this into two parts because the examples are actually getting more complex. Now, much like the Carlsen-Firouzja game, this game will probably end up as one of the most famous rapid games of all time. This was the first match game between Carlsen and Fabiano Caruana. The time scramble that led up to this position was already pretty crazy. There were a lot of twists and turns, a lot of turnarounds. Finally, Fabiano Caruana developed a massive attack against Magnus Carlsen's king, and that led up to this position on Black's 78th move. And both sides, once again, are down to just essentially increment, couple of seconds per move. So in this position, it's Black to play, and we will face the white side in this example, even though I'll ask you some questions from Black's perspective. Now, Fabiano Caruana plays by far the most obvious move in this position, and it turns out that that obvious move is what leads to calamity. It doesn't spoil the win, but it makes the win a lot harder to achieve. First step is to pause the video and see if you can find the most precise path to victory, the cleanest path to victory. So some of you may already know that Fabiano Caruana instantly played rook c6 check, thinking that the game is over because he skewers and wins a full queen, and then has a full 3 passed pawns that he can use in the subsequent pawn race to deflect white's rook. But instead, the cleanest win, the engine gives a checkmate with queen a7, but the most human path to victory is actually queen to c6 check. Then you play rook f4 check, and that's not the end of the story. White's king drops back to e3, and yes, white does make a new queen, but just look at the fact that Black has 3 extra pawns and Black's king is completely safe. The simplest here is queen e4 check, followed by queen takes b4 check. And having reached this position, Magnus would have almost certainly resigned. Black can win this position in a variety of ways. You can trade queens, you can checkmate the white king, but this is completely winning, even with just a couple of seconds on your clock. But can we blame Fabiano for immediately playing the most natural move, rook c6 check? Well, Magnus drops back to d4, Fabiano takes on c4, Magnus Carlsen takes back, and you would think that the game is over. But if you look a little bit more carefully, you should very quickly realize that the game, in a certain sense, is only beginning. This is the power of putting your rook behind a passed pawn. The pawn on d7 and the rook on d3 demand the Black queen's immediate attention. Well, Black has no choice but to put the queen behind the pawn. And now, if you've seen endgames like this before, and this is a pretty typical type of endgame construction where the rook and the pawn are kind of holding back the queen, the kind of stock winning strategy in such positions is to use whatever pawns you have to throw them down the board and to try to deflect the rook from whichever pawn it's defending in order to free up to jailbreak the queen. And of course, that sounds very easy and very neat, but in practice, it is filled with all sorts of difficulties. And indeed, Magnus Carlsen, first of all, has another passed pawn, and he sends that passed pawn up the board. And things are getting really, really scary for Black, because with just a couple of tempi, white is going to send his own pawn to b8, deflect the Black queen, and then promote the other pawn with an extra rook. What does Black do? Well, Black actually is winning here, but the path to victory is narrow and it's incredibly instructive. There's a lot of beautiful details in this endgame, so let's go through it slowly. First step, pause the video, see if you can figure out, if you can work out the entire winning sequence for Black. I'll give you a small hint. It's actually not as hard as it may appear. The key is not to be afraid of white's pawns. All right, go ahead and take your time. All right, so the correct first move is h4. Paradoxically, the correct strategy is simply to push Black's pawns as if nothing is the matter. And the key detail that you have to see is that after b7, the pawns are both located on the 7th rank. Suddenly, the queen is able to put itself right in the little gap between the pawns. And this is an amazing construction. Whichever file the king goes to, the queen captures the pawn that is on that file with a check. Obviously, king d4 loses immediately. And if the king goes to the b file, then black captures the pawn with check and then uses checks to get the queen back to its blockading post on d8. The alligator, snaps his jaws, then rushes back into the water. For example, king c2, queen c7, and queen d8. And now you can win in a variety of ways. You can just get your king to e7 and sack the queen for the pawn. You can continue pushing. This is completely winning. This is what Fabiano Caruana failed to foresee with just a couple of seconds. He panicked, thinking that b6 is coming and thinking that it will be deadly. And he delivered a completely useless check on c7 that wasted tempo and actually should have cost him and did cost him the win. Magnus drops his king back to b3. Fabi realizes that he's got no checks and he has to move the queen back to d8. Now, of course, white is unable to play b6 here because the queen will capture the pawn with check. And amazingly, Magnus Carlsen now has a draw. But as is so often the case in these types of endgames, only one move guarantees him the draw. It is a king move. That should not come as a surprise to you because you need to prepare b6. But where on earth is the king supposed to go? There's a lot of options. King c4, king a4, king a2, king c2. Where on earth should the king hide itself in order to make the draw? This is an exceedingly difficult exercise, but if you're feeling brave, and this is how you learn and how you get better at endgames, right? You challenge yourself, you get things wrong, and that's how you understand these subtle details that you can actually apply in your own games. Where should the king go? So the correct answer is back to c2. The correct answer is king to c2. Now what happens here is that after black implements the same idea, h4, b6, g5, b7, now the check on c7 is no longer effective because the king is able to hide on d1. This is the point. And now black is unable to stop both pawns at the same time. It's still a draw, but it is now black who has to walk on eggshells. And so move king c2 draws the game. After h4, b6, g5, b7, black can try g4. And in this position, there is yet another landmine to avoid. Most players would very happily promote the queen and think only white has a chance to win the game. But no, the passed pawns actually prevail. Black plays g3, and the white king is one tempo short, right? If the king was on d2, white would play king e2 and stop the pawns. Here, the rook is operating all alone. You can try rook d4, but now the third pawn rushes in to the rescue, g5. And amazingly, this is a win for black. If you play rook g4, the black king comes in. This is actually a pretty incredible construction that I don't think I've ever seen before. And black wins the game. The rook is pushed away, and black promotes both of his pawns. There's just nothing that white can do. If you try to stop the pawn like this, then black just plays h3, and g2 is coming. And if you try to use your king, well, clearly you're just not fast enough. White loses immediately. So incredibly, b8 queen is a mistake. White has to find the ultra-accurate rook to c3, intending rook c8. It's very important to keep essentially the new queen and the rook on the board. Here, after g3, rook c8, black has no choice but to take on d7. White promotes to a queen, and this once again is a draw. Black can deliver perpetual to the white king. White's king has no hiding spot, and so this is a draw by perpetual check. And so king c2 was the only drawing move. Now that's interesting, but you might wonder, well, why is Magnus Carlsen's move losing? Magnus played the move king to a4. You might wonder, well, doesn't this lead essentially to the exact same types of lines? Well, here's the difference. Fabiano correctly plays h4, Magnus plays b6, and it is in this position that Fabiano panics. With 1 second on his clock, he accidentally pushes the pawn to h3, forgetting that the rook captures the pawn with check. Fabiano just grabs his head, Magnus takes the pawn with check, and now only white is playing for the win. Instead, the big question, what would happen after g5? After b7, g4, now it should dawn on you why the king is so misplaced on a4. If white plays b8, well, we already know the outcome of this endgame. This is an even worse version for white because the king is in Timbuktu and the pawns prevail. We already know that. But if white tries to play rook c3, this is the significance of keeping the king far away from the queen's line of fire. Here, black picks up the d7 pawn with a check, forking the other pawn. So the king on a4 is very, very misplaced, and this was the winning approach for Fabiano Caruana. How did he miss this with 1 second left, right? In the game, Fabi panics with h3, Magnus says, thank you very much for the pawn. He comes back to d3, and now it is Fabiano who is fighting for the draw. He plays king f7. Magnus pushes b7. King e7 by Fabi. He is just in time. King b5 by Magnus Carlsen. He brings his king into the fray. King to c6, g4, rook e3 check, and this was the final critical moment. An exhausted Fabiano Caruana, a frustrated Fabiano Caruana, blunders horribly with king f6, allowing rook e8, and he resigns in shame. The queen has no checks, and white promotes both of his queens. What sick irony that it's not black's pawns that end up promoting, it's actually both of white's pawns. Instead, king f7 actually kept a draw. Because now if white plays rook e8, there is perpetual check, obviously with queen f6 check and queen c3 check, and white is unable to evade the diagonal checks, queen g3, queen c3, queen a3, etc. So the finale of the game was a little bit anticlimactic, but the details and the subtleties of this queen versus rook endgame are pretty incredible. And this reminds me of something that my coach would always tell me about converting endgame advantages. He would always say that when you miss the most obvious win, when you miss a very elementary win, the subsequent wins become harder and harder and harder, and you're a lot less likely to find them. So after Fabi missed queen c6, the subsequent win was like many orders of magnitude harder than queen c6. And this is what always happens, right? The wins become harder and more narrow, and suddenly you find yourself fighting for a draw. But pretty incredible that the only drawing move here is king to c2, hiding behind the rook, moving away from the queen. Magnus Carlsen is a magician. He ends up winning this game and obviously winning the tournament. Okay, on we go. I have two more examples that I wanted to get through. We're at 38 minutes. I think we're going to make it, but I don't want to rush through anything. Okay, now this is absolutely epic. This example is one of my favorites. It's honestly a wildly instructive opposite-colored bishop endgame. Now, when you hear the term opposite-colored bishop endgame, most people with even a nodding acquaintance with chess endgames immediately think draw. Opposite-colored bishop endgames are known for their ultra drawish tendencies, and that's pretty easy to understand because when you operate on an uncontested diagonal, you're able to blockade a chain of pawns. You're able to set up a light square blockade or a dark square blockade, and you get into many situations where even though one side is up several pawns, and we will see just such a situation in this game, because the other side has a monopoly on a particular color square, the pawns are unable to move forward, and essentially the attacking side is unable to make progress. Now, in this position, Naroditsky Abdusattorov has managed to create serious winning chances despite the opposite-colored bishops. He has the white pieces here, and he has a clear advantage because both his bishop and his king are much more actively placed than their counterparts. And currently, the g7 pawn is hanging, and you should quickly understand that if black plays f6 check, the white king jumps into g6, eliminates the g7 pawn, and on goes the h pawn all the way to promotion. Hikaru, whose clock was dwindling, started to panic at this moment. He wasn't expecting this endgame to present him any difficulties, and he makes a very interesting move, but that very interesting move turns out to be a losing blunder. The way to draw this endgame is actually through a series of very beautiful ideas that are almost impossible to find within the context of a time scramble. And so I won't necessarily pose this to you as an exercise. I'm just going to show you what the drawing strategy was. The drawing strategy, one of several, was to start with g6. White, of course, pushes h4. And now an extremely difficult move, bishop to e8, putting the bishop right on what seems to be the worst square on the board. Now, white has two approaches here. If white pushes h5, there is a tactical idea in this position. At this point, the basics of this idea should dawn on you. Why did we put the bishop on e8? So that we could play this brilliant move f6 check, using tactics to stop the pawn. Bishop f6, bishop takes h5, and black draws comfortably. As a matter of fact, white can even lose this endgame. It's always possible, right? If white tries to shoulder the black king, then suddenly black pushes e3, and because black is closer to the c-pawn, we encountered these types of examples in our pawn endgame videos. Black actually collects both pawns and wins the game. Now, the second approach for white is to say, no, I'm not going to let you push your f-pawn. I'm going to stake my own bishop on f6. And now black manages to go around the other side. Bishop to a4, white pushes h5, Black trades on h5, and now sacking the pawn e3. F takes e3, and the bishop stops the pawn from c2. And here, black sets up an impervious blockade. And this is a great illustration of what I said in the introduction to this example. White is an extra pawn. It's a pass pawn on h6, and because black has a complete monopoly on the light squares, white is completely unable to make progress. Black is just going to shuffle between g6 and h7 ad infinitum. There is nothing that white can do. So by combining these two ideas, one on this diagonal and one on this diagonal, black is able to stop the h-pawn miraculously. But Hikaru tries a much more radical approach. He plays the move f5, which at first sight might seem like just an insane move. But if you look at it a little bit more carefully, this move actually starts to make a lot of sense. He wants to drop the king back to f7, and his logic is that after white takes on f5 and the king moves back to f7, it's going to be very difficult for white to create a passed pawn. White's pawn structure on the king side is essentially ruined, and Hikaru was banking on the fact that his king placement is going to give him an impervious blockade. Okay, is that in fact the case? Well, actually, no. White is winning in this position. And in a time scramble, appreciating all the subtleties of even an ostensibly simple position like this one is absolutely impossible. Now, endgames vary in terms of the type of difficulty that they present. Some endgames are difficult from a calculational standpoint. They're hard to calculate. There's a lot going on. Other endgames are difficult conceptually. For example, in this endgame, it's not like you have to calculate a long variation. Rather, you have to figure out the winning setup. Black is just going to shuffle with his bishop. There's nothing that black can do in this position other than just shuffle between random squares. The point is to find the correct arrangement of our king, our pawns, and our bishop such that we prevent black from setting up a blockade on the light squares. This is a great exercise in conceptual thinking. Pause the video, see if you can find the correct setup. Okay, so the correct idea involves moving the king from g5, which seems like the most active square, over to the center of the board. The simplest win is king to f4. Now, black, of course, has to defend this pawn with bishop c6. Now we get the king to the center of the board. Stage 2 of our plan is to cycle the bishop over to g5 in order to create a force field, which will prevent black's king from moving up to f6. It'll also make sure that we can always meet g6 with f6. Actually, f takes g6 also wins the game. Black continues to shuffle with bishop b7. Now, we dodge back to d4. We attack the c4 pawn. Now, this is not a pawn that black can afford to give up, because then we get an outside passer on c3. Black has to defend, or black has to counterattack the f5 pawn. Now we move back and take the e4 pawn. So stage 1 and 2 has been complete. We have gotten the bishop to the right spot. We have gotten the king to the right spot. Now it's time for stage 3. Black continues to shuffle, whatever, bishop b7 check, bishop c8. Here is stage 3. We push h4, and finally, it is time for us to create a pass pawn with f6. Black has to acquiesce to the trade, and we get this very interesting situation with passed f and h pawns. And because of the excellent placement of white's king, black is unable to set up a blockade. Here is why. Black continues to shuffle, right? Bishop c8, whatever. Actually, bishop c8, white can play h5. So the most resilient move is bishop f3. Now we can play king back to f4, chasing away the bishop. Here we go king f5. We do a series of like small zigzags here. We're trying to basically push f4. Again, black plays bishop f3. Here we can play bishop to g5. Actually, this is a little bit overcomplicating this slightly. Let me just make sure that I have the right idea. See, this is so complicated that even having analyzed this position, I'm still struggling to get the moves right. I'm pretty sure that we can also start with the move f4. Yes, we can start with the move f4 just to prevent this whole bishop f3 nonsense. So we can start with f4. Black plays bishop e7. Now we can push f6. Okay, there we go. And this is just winning. Black shuffles. We push h4. We push f5. We drop the bishop back around. We can play king f4. We can play bishop d8. Now the king comes back around to g5, and the win is pretty elementary. We just like push the pawns. h5, h6. Now we can play, where's the win? Yeah, f6. This is actually ultra complicated. King g8, king f5. Yes, king e5. And now the final stage. Okay, this is actually a great experience for me because what you can see is I spent a couple hours preparing this video, and I just kind of assumed, I was under the influence that once you played f6 and reached this ideal setup, the win was really elementary, but actually it's not, and it requires one more step. So after we complete the process of just like moving the pawns to h6 and f6, there's one more subtlety, which is to get the king back to the queen side, back to d4. Black continues to shuffle, and now the critical idea. Let's say we go bishop e7, black plays king f7. If black moves the bishop, then we can go h7 and f7. So actually this square is very important for the bishop. Black has to remain on this diagonal. And now we force Zugzwang with king d5. There we go. We force Zugzwang. Of course, black cannot give up the c4 pawn. If black plays king g8, we go king e6, bishop g6, and now the final detail, a beautiful sacrifice, h7, deflecting either the king or the bishop from its protection of the f7 square. And finally, we have beaten the blockade. This is what it takes, ladies and gentlemen. So let's go through that again one more time. So, what is the winning plan? Very simple, right? Stage 1, we get the king from g5 over to e5. King f4, king e5. Stage 2, we get the bishop to g5. Stage 3 is we go king to d4, and we force black to either play bishop a6 or bishop c8. Basically, we win the e4 pawn by attacking the c4 pawn. Boom. Stage 4, we push f6, but we do it after pushing f4, so that black's bishop doesn't land on f3. If black's bishop lands on f3 here, then we can like cycle around with our king until we're able to play f4. Bishop c8, we push, we push f4. We can also push h4, it doesn't really matter. We push f6, and this is stage 4. Stage 5 is we get these two pawns to h6 and f6 respectively. And we do that by shuffling our king where needed. Stage 6, we get our king over to the queen side, tying the bishop down both to the c4 pawn and to the h7 square. The bishop sticks on e7, and this is the completion of the penultimate stage. Black is now in full Zugzwang. By the way, if king e8, then again, there's this trick with checkmate. And the final stage is using tactics to break down the blockade one final time. I mean, absolute insanity, right? And I'm sure I made some inaccuracies there in my analysis. Please forgive me. I did my best. But the point of these videos is also just to inspire you a little bit, right? To inspire you to analyze on your own, and to show you just how complex these endgames are. Now, we haven't even gotten to the game continuation yet. In the game, Naroditsky plays what seems to be a completely innocuous move. He plays the move h4. Okay, well, that seems completely normal, but it actually gives up the win. Black now drops the bishop into a4. Naroditsky starts the correct winning procedure, it seems, with king f4 and king e5. And you might say, well, what on earth has changed, right? Everything seems to be the same. And yet, what has changed is that black's bishop is now occupying an ideal defensive position. It's occupying d3. Whereas in the winning line, the black bishop is unable to get to d3, right? It's unable to get to d3 because we simply eliminate the e4 pawn. Whereas in the game, Hikaru was able to get his bishop to the right square at the right time. This position was reached, and Hikaru once again gives up the draw with bishop f1. He simply gives away the pawn. And he gives Naroditsky a chance, once again, to execute the correct plan with bishop e3, bishop g5, and f4, which Naroditsky doesn't do, as we'll get to in just a second. What was the drawing move? Well, in order to draw the game, black had to keep the bishop on d3 at all costs. Where were we? Yeah, black had to keep the bishop on d3 at all costs. And so the correct move was simply to shuffle with black's king g8. Now, what Hikaru missed in time pressure is that after a move like king to e6, black's bishop is now free to roam about the cabin. Here we simply play bishop e2, and this is a very easy draw. But likely Naroditsky would have played the far trickier move king to d6, which sets up an absolutely devilish threat. It seems like black can continue to shuffle, and yet in this position, out of nowhere, there comes an incredible winning shot. Pause the video, see if you can spot it. Okay, The correct move, yes, is bishop takes g7. What we have been missing in this exercise is a bishop sacrifice, clearing the way for white's king, and the f-pawn promotes by force. e3, by the way, we have f6 check, and we can just play f takes e3 and f7, winning the game. And so it's crucial for black, after king d6, to push e3. e3, we've already seen this type of idea opening up the bishop from behind. And of course, this position is a very easy draw. Black just reparks the bishop on d3, and now black sets up a very simple blockade on the e6 square. White can even push e6, it doesn't change anything. As you can see, both of these pawns are on light squares, so they can always be defended by the bishop, and the king can never be checked. It will never budge because it is on a light square. Another good illustration of the drawish tendencies inherent in opposite-colored bishop endings. But Hikaru, he didn't realize that the e4 pawn was important. And so he gave that pawn away. Noterbeck took it, but Noterbeck went the wrong way. At first, he played correctly, king e5. And this is where he missed the winning approach with bishop e3 and bishop g5. He decided to go the other way. He decided to go back to g5. And now he decided this was the last chance. He can still go back to e5. Now he decided to play h5. This gives away the win for good. Hikaru plays bishop d3. Noterbeck has to create a passed pawn with f6. It is now too late to revert to the correct plan because every time white goes king f4, black's bishop will return to e2 and harass the h-pawn. And after f6, to Noterbeck's great horror, he realized in this moment that there is absolutely nothing that white can do. The critical point, the critical difference, is that in this very same position, if white's king was on e5, this would be winning because white would be able to push the pawn up to f5. As it stands, that's it. Black has full control over the f5 square forever. And white will never be able to cross the plane, to cross h6 with either the bishop, with either the king or the pawn. Noterbeck tried, he shuffled around, but there is simply nothing that he can do. Hikaru even provoked h6, and it's still a dead draw. Obviously, if Noterbeck goes this way, then Hikaru can meet him on b5. There is nothing that white can do. Noterbeck shuffled the pieces a couple of times and quickly acquiesced to a draw. It's worth just staring at this position for a bit and convincing yourself that, yes, it is in fact a draw. Look at how the blockade on the light squares works. Look at how, despite the fact that black has only a king and a bishop, black holds back white's entire army, 2 pawns included. And that is how Mr. Nakamura was able to save, in improbable fashion, this insane opposite-colored bishop ending. Okay, now I have one other brilliant example, which comes from the game Noterbeck Abdusattorov versus Denis Lazovic. But this example, on top of some others, I will save for part 2. It's already been 55 minutes. I know I've already given you a lot of material to chew on. I really don't want to bog you down with too much stuff. I know that can be detrimental. So if you're still watching, if you're still taking notes, thank you so much. These endgame videos are a little bit risky because I know I go fast. I know there's a lot of variations, and I know that for newer players, some of this might be tough to follow. And that is why I always say, pause the video, have a board next to you, and it's always okay to make mistakes. You can see that I made a ton of mistakes in presenting this video, and I'm not ashamed to admit that. Endgames are the most complicated part of the game. And the way that we learn is by getting our hands dirty, right? By moving pieces around and understanding the patterns. So we went through, discounting the Firouzja Naroditsky example, we went through 5 examples. A quick recap. We talked about this devilish drawing mechanism and the way that black parries it with his knight. We talked about the under promotion in Carlsen Firouzja. We looked at the supplementary game that I played against Firouzja. We looked at the crazy endgame in Carlsen Caruana. And we finished with one of the most instructive opposite-colored bishop endings that I have ever seen, where Hikaru had the draw with g6, lost the game with f5, and then somehow was able to recover and hold the draw. Okay, with that, folks, the Whirlwind Tour comes to an end. There will be a part 2. I definitely want to look at Abdusattorov versus Lazovic, as well as a couple of other complicated endgames. But for now, I'm pretty exhausted. That was a lot of endgames. So give yourself a nice pat on the back, and I will see you in another video soon. Thank you so much for watching. Please feel free to point out corrections in the comment section. I hope you enjoyed the video and found it instructive. I'll see you guys soon.